As a child, James had always dreamed of owning a house that was uniquely his own. He had spent years living in cramped apartments and sharing walls with neighbors who often made their presence known at all hours. The idea of a secluded place, nestled away from the chaos of the city, had always appealed to him. It seemed like the perfect escape, a place where he could work in peace and let his mind roam free without distractions. So, when the opportunity came to purchase a house in the countryside, James jumped at the chance. The house itself was beautiful, in a way that might have seemed eerie to others, but to him it was exactly what he had been looking for. Its age gave it character. The weathered stones of the foundation, the creaking wooden beams, and the large windows that allowed the sunlight to stream in at all hours. It stood alone on a hill, surrounded by overgrown trees and dense foliage, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it again. The house had been abandoned for several years, but James felt it had a sort of quiet charm that no modern home could match. From the moment he stepped inside, James felt an odd sense of belonging. The air was thick with dust, and the floors seemed to groan under his weight. The house had been well maintained over the years, but there was something about it that made James feel as if the place had been frozen in time. There were no modern updates or renovations, just the original fixtures, the same old wallpaper peeling slightly at the edges, and the faint smell of mothballs lingering in the corners. He didn't mind the isolation. It was a welcome change after living in a noisy apartment for so long. But as the days passed and James settled in, he began to notice something strange. At first it was easy to dismiss as a figment of his imagination. It started with faint, irregular sounds, footsteps. They were soft at first, almost like a whisper against the floorboards, but they were unmistakable. Every night, after the sun had gone down and the house had settled into silence, he would hear them, footsteps coming from upstairs. James was quick to reason it away. The house was old, after all. Perhaps it was just the natural settling of the wood or the sound of the house adjusting to the temperature change from day to night. But as the days turned into weeks, the sounds persisted. They weren't constant, but they were enough to unsettle him, always occurring at night when the house was at its quietest. Sometimes they were faint, as if someone was walking slowly across the floor. And other times, they were louder, almost as if someone was pacing back and forth above him. One evening, after the sounds had kept him up for hours, James decided to investigate. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though he couldn't explain why. The house, while old, felt empty in a way that was different from the isolation he had expected. It was as if something was missing, or perhaps someone had been there long ago and had never truly left. He climbed the stairs cautiously, the creak of each step echoing through the silence. The hall above was dimly lit by the light of a single lamp that flickered weakly, as if struggling to stay on. The air felt thick up here, almost suffocating, as if the house had absorbed the weight of countless years. James moved slowly down the hallway, peering into each room as he passed. There were several bedrooms, each one nearly identical. Old furniture, dusty curtains, and bare walls that seemed to be waiting for something to fill them. Yet there was no sign of anyone having been here recently. No sign of life at all, except for the unsettling footsteps that continued to echo in his mind. He reached the end of the hall, where an old wooden door stood ajar. The room beyond was dark, the windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked out the moonlight. James stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, as if it had never been properly heated. He felt an eerie chill run down his spine as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. At first he saw nothing but shadows, but as his gaze shifted, he noticed something strange. A guest book on the small desk in the corner. It wasn't an ordinary guest book. It was leather-bound with frayed edges, and it looked as if it had been untouched for years. James approached it slowly, his curiosity piqued. The book was placed open to the first page, and as he examined it, he realized it was filled with names. The handwriting was old and faded, but each name was signed with a date, each entry made in a different year, spanning decades. Some names were familiar to him, perhaps old residents of the town, but there were others that seemed completely foreign. James turned the pages slowly, trying to decipher the names and wondering about the people who had stayed in this room over the years. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed a strange pattern. Every year, a name had been signed without fail, but the entries didn't stop after a few years. The names continued to appear long after the house had been abandoned, and in each case, the same name appeared, always in the same hand, always signed in the same style. James's heart began to race. There was something deeply unsettling about the guest book. He couldn't explain why, but it felt wrong, as if the book had been waiting for him to find it. And yet, the most disturbing part wasn't the names themselves. It was the fact that his own name was written at the very end of the book, signed in the same handwriting, with the date marking the day he had arrived at the house. He slammed the book shut, his pulse quickening. The room suddenly felt even colder, and the air seemed to press in on him, thick with an unseen presence. He had to get out of there. But as he turned to leave, he heard it again, the sound of footsteps, this time louder than ever, coming from above. It was as if someone was standing in the hall, waiting for him. James bolted from the room and ran back down the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he had to do. He had to leave the house. It wasn't just the footsteps or the strange guest book that unsettled him. It was the sense that something was waiting for him, something that had been there long before he had arrived, something that had been watching him, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. That night, after locking all the doors and checking every window, James lay in bed, unable to sleep. He kept his eyes fixed on the shadows in the corners of his room, convinced that something was lurking just beyond his sight. The footsteps continued, relentless and unceasing, as though they were following him, tracking his every movement. They grew louder as the night went on, moving closer and closer until they reached the stairs. James held his breath as the sound of footsteps grew louder until, at last, they stopped. It was quiet for a moment, an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. And then the unmistakable sound of footsteps began again, this time coming down the stairs. James woke with a jolt, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was pitch black, save for the faint sliver of moonlight peeking through the curtains. His breathing was shallow and quick as he sat up in bed, trying to shake the fog of sleep from his mind. The footsteps that had haunted him throughout the night had stopped, but they had left behind an overwhelming sense of dread that lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. For a long moment, James didn't move, unsure of what he should do. The footsteps, those soft, unsettling sounds, had stopped just outside his room. He strained his ears, listening for any sign that they would begin again. But there was only silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. With trembling hands, James reached for the lamp on his nightstand and flicked it on. The soft glow of light illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the walls. His eyes flickered nervously to the door, which was still partially ajar, as if someone had been standing there, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. But there was no one there. Nothing but the silence. Taking a deep breath, James climbed out of bed, his feet cold against the wooden floor. The air in the room felt stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. He crept toward the door and peered into the hallway. The house was still, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had to know what was causing the footsteps. Had he imagined it? Was it just the house settling, as he had convinced himself earlier? Or was there something more sinister at play? The guest book, the name that had appeared at the end, his name. The realization hit him like a cold wave crashing over him. He had to go back to the room. He had to figure out why it was there, why his name had been written in that book. James hesitated, his gaze drifting back to the hallway. The staircase loomed ahead, its shadow stretching down toward him. The steps were dark, ominous, and he could feel the pull of something beyond them, something that had been waiting for him, something that had been waiting for years. The footsteps from upstairs had been so real, but the guest book, his name, couldn't have been a coincidence. Someone had written it there. Someone who had stayed in this house before him. But who? And why had they written his name? His mind raced with questions, none of which seemed to have an answer. All he knew was that he couldn't stay in this room any longer. The longer he stayed, the more the house seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with its secrets. He had to find out what had happened here. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and made his way toward the stairs, his steps hesitant but determined. The house was eerily quiet, the silence pressing in on him like a physical force. As he descended the stairs, he was struck by the faint smell of something old and musty, as though the house itself had been forgotten by time. The stairs creaked beneath his weight, each step seeming to echo through the empty house, reminding him of the footsteps that had so unnerved him just hours earlier. At the bottom of the stairs, James paused. He could feel it, an unnatural cold that seemed to seep through the walls, making the air feel thick and heavy. It was as if the house had absorbed the chill of the night, trapping it inside. He shivered involuntarily, but he didn't turn back. He couldn't. Not now. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by the weak light from the lamp. The guest room was just ahead, the door still slightly ajar, as if it were waiting for him to return. He walked toward it, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. When he reached the door, James hesitated again, his hand hovering over the handle. Something was telling him not to go inside, to leave this place behind, but he couldn't. Not after everything he had discovered. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was just as he had left it, dimly lit, with the same heavy curtains blocking out the light. The guest book was still on the desk, its pages waiting for him. James walked toward it, the floor creaking beneath his feet. The chill in the air seemed to intensify as he approached the desk, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He had to see it again, had to make sense of it. His fingers trembled as he reached for the book, flipping it open to the last page. The same name stared back at him, his name signed in the same handwriting, just as it had been before. He felt his pulse quicken as he read the date. His arrival at the house, the day he had moved in. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over him. How could this be? It didn't make sense. The handwriting was too familiar, yet too foreign. It was as if he had seen it before, but he couldn't place where. His mind raced, trying to piece together the mystery. But the more he thought about it, the more disoriented he became. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, and James spun around in shock. His heart skipped a beat, and he gasped for air, his throat tightening. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on him. The temperature had dropped even further, and he could see his breath in the air. The footsteps began again. This time, they were unmistakable. They were coming from upstairs, moving down the hallway toward him. Slowly, deliberately. The sound of each footstep was heavy, echoing through the house like a drum beat. James's pulse raced as he backed away from the desk, his mind screaming for him to run. But his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just outside the door. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and he could feel the weight of something, someone, standing just beyond the door. He could almost hear their breath, ragged and uneven, just on the other side. Without thinking, he reached for the doorknob and yanked the door open. But there was no one there. No one at all. The hallway was empty. James stepped into the hallway, his eyes darting back and forth. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was as if the house had swallowed the sound, trapping it within its walls. The cold had settled in, creeping under his skin and making him feel as though he were no longer alone. He turned toward the stairs, his eyes locked on the darkened hallway at the top. The air grew thicker, and he felt a strange pressure building in his chest, as if the very house itself was drawing him in. He climbed the stairs, his every step echoing in the silence. The farther he went, the more the house seemed to pulse with a strange energy, an unseen force tugging at him, pulling him forward. When he reached the top of the stairs, the door to the room he had first entered was closed, but it wasn't the same. The door was slightly ajar now, the handle turning as if someone had been inside. James felt a chill run down his spine as he approached the door. He could hear the faintest whisper coming from within, like a voice calling out to him, though he couldn't make out the words. It was a voice he thought he recognized, but it was muffled, as if it were coming from a great distance. He reached for the doorknob again, his hand shaking. The coldness in the air was unbearable now, and he could feel the weight of something pressing in on him from all sides. And then, as his fingers brushed the doorknob, the whisper stopped. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the darkness within. James hesitated at the threshold, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as his heart hammered in his chest. The darkness within the room seemed to swallow the light from the hallway, an inky void that seemed to beckon him forward. It was as though the house itself was drawing him in, urging him to step closer to the unknown, to face whatever it was that had haunted this place for so long. He swallowed hard, his hand trembling as it hovered over the doorknob. The voice he thought he had heard, the faint whisper that had disappeared just moments ago, had left a chill in the air. It was no longer a haunting sound, but a warning. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, to run, to escape whatever fate awaited him in that room. But something deep inside told him that he could not. He had already crossed the point of no return, and there was no turning back now. With a shaky breath, James stepped into the room. The air inside was thick, heavier than it had been anywhere else in the house. It was as though the room itself was saturated with time, the very walls exuding a sense of ancient, unrelenting presence. He looked around, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness, but there was nothing that he could see. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, a creak. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet, and the shadows seemed to shift around him as if they were alive, moving with a will of their own. James's eyes darted across the room, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. His flashlight flickered, casting an eerie glow across the walls, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to focus on anything. The room felt like a blur, a dizzying maze of shadows and strange angles. And then, there it was, a figure. It appeared out of the darkness, moving slowly, deliberately, as if it had been there all along, waiting for him. At first, James thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the longer he stared, the more distinct the figure became. It was a woman, tall and thin, her long, flowing hair tumbling down her back like a river of dark silk. Her clothes were old-fashioned, out of place, as though they belonged to a different time. Her face, though hidden in shadow, exuded an air of calm, of patience. She stood there, unmoving, as if she had been waiting for him to arrive. James froze. His mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing, but there was no explanation. He could feel her gaze, even though her eyes were hidden. It was as though she was looking right through him, into his soul, knowing him in ways that no one ever had. And then she spoke, But it wasn't words. Number, it was something more. A sound that resonated deep within his chest, a vibration that seemed to echo in the very core of his being. It was a voice, but not one that could be heard with the ears. It was a voice that reached into his heart and whispered directly into his thoughts. You were always meant to be here. The words washed over him like a wave, and James staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. His hands were trembling now, the flashlight falling from his grip and rolling across the floor, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. He couldn't look away from the figure, couldn't tear his eyes from her, even as the weight of her presence grew heavier, more oppressive. This is your place, the voice continued. This house, it has chosen you. You were meant to find it. You were meant to stay. The cold grew more intense, and James shivered, his body recoiling from the force of the invisible pressure pressing down on him. It felt as though the air itself was thick with a sense of inevitability, as though every moment in his life had led him here, to this room, to this moment. He couldn't speak, he couldn't breathe. His mind was reeling, struggling to comprehend the impossible reality before him. Was this a dream? A nightmare? Had he lost his mind? He had to get out. He had to run. But then, the woman stepped forward, her movement graceful and slow like the ebbing of a tide. Her eyes, though shrouded in shadow, seemed to glow with an ethereal light. As she approached, the room around James began to shift. The shadows lengthened, swirling around him like a storm. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as if the house itself was alive, breathing with him. I was here before you, the voice whispered, this time not in his mind but out loud, though her lips did not move. I was here long ago, and I left something behind, something that was meant for you. James stumbled back, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. He had heard stories of haunted houses, of restless spirits and dark forces, but this was different. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something far older, far more powerful than anything he could have imagined. And it was calling to him. It was drawing him in. The air crackled, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, though the windows were closed. The shadows around him seemed to twist and writhe, taking on strange, monstrous shapes that reached for him, their long, twisted fingers beckoning him closer. The woman's form was now just a silhouette, her figure fading into the swirling darkness. You will stay, she intoned. You will remain like all those before you. And when your time comes, you will leave your mark just as I did, just as they did. The words echoed in his mind, but before he could react, the shadows closed in on him, enveloping him, suffocating him with their weight. He gasped, his lungs burning as he struggled to breathe, but it was no use. The darkness consumed him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The house fell silent. The oppressive weight of the shadows lifted, and the coldness receded. James gasped for air, his chest heaving as he looked around, bewildered. The room was empty. The woman was gone. The shadows had dissipated, leaving nothing but the familiar dim light of the hallway spilling in from the door. James stood there, his heart pounding, his mind a blur. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare? He didn't know. All he knew was that the house felt different now. It felt complete. He felt complete. And then, as if in answer to his unspoken thoughts, his eyes were drawn to the guest book on the desk. It was open, as it had been before,
And just like before, a new entry had appeared. This time, however, it was not his name. It was not the familiar handwriting that had startled him earlier. No, this time it was a new name altogether. And beneath it, in bold, unmistakable letters, was the date. The date of the day he had arrived. His mind raced, but before he could make sense of it, the door to the room creaked open behind him. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat, and there, standing in the doorway, was the woman. But she was no longer a shadow. She was no longer a figure of darkness. Her features were clear now, her eyes bright and luminous, her skin pale but radiant, her expression serene. She smiled at him, and in that smile James saw everything, the truth, the answer, the knowledge that had eluded him all along. "Welcome home," she said, her voice soft and warm, and with that James understood. This was where he was meant to be. This house, this place had always been his, and now he was part of it, bound to it in a way he could never escape. The woman turned, and as she did, the room around James seemed to come alive. The walls shimmered with light, and the air was filled with a strange, unearthly hum. It was as though the house itself was awakening, stretching, reaching towards something beyond. James stepped forward, his feet light as if he were floating, his mind at peace. The darkness had been lifted, the footsteps had stopped. And as he walked out into the hallway, he knew that he was no longer just a visitor. He was part of the house. He was part of its story, and soon he would leave his name in the guest book, just like all those before him.